In this video, we're really going to dive into this idea of how do you write your own class. In the last video, we talked about the student class and this program that used it called the student program. I want to really distinguish those in your mind. There's a big difference between student program and the student class. Remember, the student class is the abstract representation of a student. You could think of it as a template for making what a student object would look like. The student program is actually just a program that uses that class in some way. So the student program has a student in it or has an instance of the student class in it. This isn't really a class where you guys ever take notes, but if we're thinking about it, our notes for today really are this. This is going to be linked in all of the videos below, and this is also posted on Schoology. So these are the big tenets we're going to be thinking of as we go through the process of creating new classes. To start out, let's take a look at a program. We're going to do this in pretty much the same way we did with student program and student, but now we're going to look at a program that has a class that actually hasn't been written yet. We're going to double click on employee program. And let's take a look. Here's the employee program. Nothing that crazy. It's not compiling because if you notice in the project, there's actually no employee class. And that's because we're going to write it in just a minute. Here's the employee program. I'm creating a new employee called person. Here I say new employee. Remember, this calls that thing called the constructor, which we're going to have to write. Looks like this constructor is going to take two parameters, probably the name of the employee and that employee's salary or starting salary. Looks like there's a method where I can raise the salary of the employee. And there's a method where I can get the employee's name and get their salary. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to make a new class. So let's go here. Let's click the new class button. And now's a good time to point out, I hate that this button says new class because it's not always just a basic class we're going to be making. When I do this, what does my class have to be called? Capital E employee. It has to exactly match what it says in the program. So employee. There's my class. Let's put it over by the employee program. And let's open it. Now you might be kind of frustrated that you actually can't see these side by side, but if you actually kind of right click on this, you can do move tab to a new window, and I can actually look at these next to each other, which can be really useful when we're doing stuff like this. All right. To start, this is what you're given when you create a new class. All you're given is the shell of that class and the shell of a constructor. Now you'll notice it's not necessarily the correct constructor. We might have to change this, but it does give you kind of the starter code for the constructor. What is the first step we have to do when we're making a class? Let's go ahead and look at our Big Brother is Watching propaganda page. Up here, these are the steps for how you make a class. Let's do step 0 first, which is to determine the method signatures. Now, when we did this last time, we did this as a list over on the side. Now we're going to write them as shells of methods. So to start, let's start with the constructor. Is the method signature for the constructor correct? I don't think so. And that's because, doesn't my constructor over here actually take some parameters? It totally does. What's the type of the first parameter? It's a string. So let's do string. I'm going to do employee name. And then that looks like that's going to be a double. Let's do double starting salary. Great. So I think I fixed my constructor method signature. Let's go ahead and look at the next one. It looks like there's a method used on this line. What's the name of this method? Is going to be raise salary. It looks like it's on a line by itself, so it probably doesn't return anything. So public void raise salary. Does this method take any parameters? Yeah, it does. It looks like this is a number. Probably, since this seems like it's going to be money, let's make this a double. So let's do double raise. amount. You can choose whatever names you want for your parameters. There's not a right answer. Usually more descriptive is better, but I could have called this amount. Technically, I could have called it X. Doesn't matter all that much at the end of the day. Great, so we've got one. Looks like we have a method here called getName. That probably returns a string. So let's do public string getName. And it looks like it takes no parameters. And public, look, the last one over here is getSalary. My salary is probably going to be a double, so let's make this public double getSalary. And no parameters. And there we go. We've done step 0, which is to make the method signatures. You'll notice right now it's a little bit mad at me, and that's because if you hover over this, it says there's a missing return statement. When you say you're going to return something in a method in Java, aka I put something here that's not void, that's a signal to Java that you must have that special keyword called return. If you don't have that, this is Java flagging to you, hey, you promised you were going to return something in this method, and you didn't actually follow through on that promise since you're missing the word return somewhere in here. So we're going to fix that in just a second when we add in code to these, but for now, this actually will be a little bit angry at me. All right, let's look at the next step. Decide what/how many private instance variables you need to keep track of the state of an instance. Remember, my private instance variables go up at the top here, and these are the variables that basically encapsulate all the information an employee needs to know. What does an employee need to know about themselves to be able to do these methods? Well, don't they need to know their name and their salary? Let's do private string name and private double salary. Notice how I didn't put any equal signs up here. I did not give these variables values up at the top. When I make my private instance variables, all I'm doing is declaring them. Where do I give my private instance variables values? In the constructor. And why is that? Because the job of the constructor is to initialize the private instance variables. I told you, it's going to be everywhere. Now that we have our private instance variables, the last step for each method, we're going to write code referring to those private instance variables. Great. Let's start with the constructor. Remember, the constructor sets the initial values of these variables. So when I first create an employee, isn't their name whatever's passed in here as a parameter? So let's do name equals employee name. And isn't their salary whatever the starting salary is that's passed in? So salary equals starting salary. Make sure when you're writing these lines in the constructor, you don't accidentally flip the order. It's always private instance variable equals value. Again, because in the constructor, I initialize my private instance variables, that means I must have name equals something and salary equals something in my constructor. When I first made the parameters to my constructor, you may have been wondering why I chose these longer names, employee name and starting salary, for those parameters. And you can kind of see now that that's because I was saving name and salary to be the names of my private instance variables. You aren't allowed to name your private instance variables the same things as the parameters to the constructor because Java won't know which ones you're talking about. It's pretty common to save the shorter, more specific name for the private instance variables because you're probably going to be typing those more as you write your class. What happens when I raise the salary? Well, the salary should go up by the amount it's raised by. So here, let's have salary equals salary plus raise amount. GetName. GetName is a method that returns a string back to me, and probably what I want this to do is return name. I want to give back the name of the employee. Very similar for getSalary. What's this going to do? I'm going to return salary. And I think this is it. If we compile this right now, You might have to actually go back to the employee program and add a space before you compile it, but this should compile if we've done everything correctly. And you should be able to run the employee program now since we couldn't before. And it's not all that exciting. It just tells us how much Bruce Wayne makes, which it's a little curious that Bruce Wayne is able to keep up the Batcave on an $11,000 salary. I guess if it was $11,000 a week, maybe, but I don't even know if that would be enough to maintain his entire crazy lifestyle. So again, the first time we've written a class, and we're sticking to these 3 steps here. We always determine the method signatures first, figure out our private instance variables, and that question there is the idea of what does an employee need to know or need to track about themselves. And then we're going to write some code using those private instance variables to make every method after that work. All right, I'm going to close out of these. And now what I want you to do is on your own, you're going to do that same process with the product program. The product program is pretty similar to the employee program. It's not too complicated. You're going to take a look at this, and it's your job to write the product class. Again, follow the 3 steps. Start with the method signatures. Then figure out your private instance variables, then fill in the code inside your methods. And remember, what's the job of the constructor? It's to initialize the private instance variables.